Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Hope everyone had a nice little break. And now we've got a little informal session. So if people want a longer break, of course, they can take a longer break. But it's a nice place to kind of ease into our last two sessions for today. And so the question I kind of selected on today for this informal break session was about Spinoza. And it's really thinking about it from a student's perspective. You know, the students, I find students oftentimes struggle a bit with it, with the exposition of the ethics. And some of them get really turned off by it. So I just would like to maybe throw it open to see how you guys all solve that problem if you've encountered that before. So I'll open the floor. Is that something that people find in your experience when you teach Spinoza, that the ethics students struggle with the ethics? Raphael?
Hi there. Well, I don't focus very much on the geometrical mode of exposition because I think, for an introductory undergraduate course, because I think that the theories and propositions themselves are complicated enough. I do want them to be aware of the method of exposition, but I tend to just have them focus on the positive claims that Spinoza is putting forth. And the question of exactly how he establishes those claims, that can wait for an upper level course, I think. That's my approach, though. Do other people have a different tactic?
So, hi everybody. I teach Spinoza's books 1 and 2 and gesture at other things that he's doing. I have the good fortune that we split 17th and 18th century apart from each other, so they're separate courses. But I have developed a worksheet to get them accustomed to the geometric method based on a worksheet that I had found on Walter Ott's homepage, and so it works them through it. It's basically a fill in the blank where they have to do a kind of scavenger hunt to find the propositions and the definitions and the axioms that are used in the proofs. And so I find that actually gets them accustomed to it, and then they start to look for it. They're primed to look for it themselves. And so what we find, one of the things that I really emphasize, because it's of interest to me, is just what a weird proposition 5 is in the first book, and what some of those axioms initially seem very plausible, and then as you get moving along, it's just like, whoa, hang on, he takes that to say a whole lot more than what we thought. And so I emphasize more of the proofs than just the wild, exciting claims, because I think the nature of those claims can start to shift once you start to look at how the proofs are supposed to work.
Anne-Marie, would you be willing to share that that handout that you have or worksheet that you have?
I just want Ott's interpretation, but yeah. So is there a way to? I don't want to do screen sharing right now. That would be weird. But if there's a Google Drive or something.
Well, you can add. You should be able to add a file into the chat.
Oh, okay. Oh yeah, I see that. Oh, Zoom is so fancy.
Zoom's got some nice features. It's got some drawbacks, but some features are nice. So I think people might appreciate having that access to that if you're willing to share. What about others? Do other people find that, you know, Christopher, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so this might be similar, but I sort of like to suggest to my students that the geometric fashion is trying to give us a model of the mechanism of nature. So we start with the definitions and the axioms and say these are sort of the building blocks of nature, literally. And let's see how Spinoza thinks these building blocks fit together to necessitate the way the world itself is structured. I simplify it, I leave out a lot of propositions, but I sort of make it worth their while to put in the time to try and piece a geometric system together by saying, look, it's possible that's expressing his ideas. This is him trying to capture verbally the way that the world is structured ontologically. And with that sort of excitement, I think it gets students sort of, jazzed about trying to see the world in this way. And so that alongside many simplifications, and students seem to at least appreciate it, for the bit of time that we spend on it.
They appreciate it, or do you appreciating it's one thing, right? But how successful would you want to? Are they enthused? Are they? Do you have any Spinoza converts?
I have. It's hard for me to hide my enthusiasm for Spinoza, no matter how much I try. And so I actually have a lot of students who convert to it just because I love it so much. But yeah, it's definitely very challenging. And I think the ideas that most of them take away from it are, the more exciting ideas and less appreciating the geometric presentation. So that part, I think, is, I think like Rafi said, upper level classes, you can do more of that, but the lower level classes, it's just much more difficult.
Perhaps another related question is simply, I know that not everyone here necessarily is a Spinoza nut, but what are some interesting strategies people use to get students excited about some of the more idiosyncratic features of the philosophies we're presenting?
I would follow it up, Rafi, and say, how many people use Spinoza's life story to motivate his thinking? I like to call Leibniz God's lawyer, and I tell my students, if God ever needed a lawyer, he could do a lot worse than Leibniz, and I'm not even sure he could do better. And that excites them, right? Talk about Leibniz's life and what he tried to do. I don't do that as much with Spinoza because it's already so hard. But I wonder if, more of the life story, especially his excommunication, things like that, might be a way of, entering that, I guess.
Hoping.
Hey, everyone. Raphael Spinoza here. I'm one of the, I'm a Kant scholar, but I am a Spinoza nut. So just to second what Chris was saying, so I do actually use a lot of, I talk a lot about Spinoza's background. So I talk a lot about the Inquisition, and I connected that with racism, both in, racism in all sorts of ways. And so I connected that with my own experience. I tell my students why I'm a Spinoza nut, why Spinoza speaks to me in particular, sometimes in view of my own experience with racism. And also my husband is Jewish. And so this really kind of makes it personal for me. And one thing I think, so my view is that no matter how you teach them, if you become really, if you show how enthusiastic you are about a philosopher, inevitably you'll actually convert a lot of students. One thing I learned is that every semester I converted quite a few students to Spinoza camp. And I have never succeeded in converting Kantians. So.
Do you think that says something about Kant or something about the students?
I don't know. I think it could be myself. So my students know that I'm a Kant scholar. I know, like, hopefully there's no Kant scholarship here. But no offense to Kant scholarship. But my students know that I'm a Kant scholar, but aspire to Spinozism in my own life. And so I tell my students how Spinoza, reading Spinoza gives me hope, whereas reading Kant leaves me cold. So, so that's me. I don't think it has anything to do with students. And so when I bring Spinozism to life in my own way, students really respond to that. That's my experience. Yeah.
Anyone have any other thoughts or reflections? Any ways in which you find Spinoza to be challenging in the classroom or challenging for your students?
Actually, Benjamin, I wouldn't mind just coming back to Chris's point about biographies. I think that if I could, I would try to teach every idea that I want to convey to students with some kind of story, because that makes an idea speak to you and makes it feel meaningful. I often just don't know all the stories behind every idea, but I think that, you know, if you introduce Descartes by, I don't know, telling about his dreams, for example, those 3 dreams, I think it's a really gripping tale, and it helps, and it's a way of leading students into the philosophy. With Spinoza, there are so many good tales. You know, there's the moment where he almost died because he wanted to protest some political violence. You know, his roommate locked him indoors, or so the story goes. Who could fail to identify with Spinoza, who wants to put his body on the line for something political? And then it leads into a question of, well, what is freedom, for example?
Thanks for that. Thanks for that. Has anyone ever tried to teach Spinoza as a guide for the students to live their life, as a lived philosophy for the students? I mean, that seems to be kind of a theme that's coming out here, is that there's a lot in Spinoza, a lot that's compelling about his ideas and his example, that maybe Spinoza could be someone that the students could emulate. Anyone approach it that way?
I would maybe just modify that. Does anyone ever get past the first couple of propositions in book 2? I would love to learn more about Spinoza's ethical project in books 5 and 4 on my own, but with my students, we can never get to that. I know some people might jump to that, or some people might read the TTP and get more of this, and I haven't done that, and I would love to hear if anyone has, because it seems a smart thing to do for me. I just am sort of afraid of it.
I have the exact opposite, because I don't know Spinoza all that well. So I have a real fear of teaching the first 2 books, precisely for the reasons that we're talking about. How do you get your students to do this? Because I find it hard myself to read the geometric method. But I do teach the TTP, and I just have to recommend, it's hugely fun. And the students just love it. So if you want a fun class, and what I do is I just take parts of books 3, 4, and 5, and you don't have to do much really. You just have to talk, well, and 2, you talked about the conatus, and then you have, and of course I do the argument for, you know, necessitarianism and God being just one substance. But you need very little of the metaphysics and the epistemology in order to be able to then show how the TTP, because he talks about it being a propedeutic in a sense to the ethics, and you know, and it's not all in the ethics, but then once you have just a little bit of what's in the ethics, and you don't have to, you know, be really serious about all the, you just have to, like as Raphael was saying, you just have to, you know, hit the high points. I mean, in this respect, and just sort of give them the view and give them a little bit of the arguments, and then, you know, what is power, you know, persevering in our being, just all that stuff. And then it's like the TTP just unfolds for you in a sense. Like you can just work in stuff from the ethics. And I have to say, it's just a lot of fun. So I recommend it highly because it's fun to teach and because the students get into it.
Thanks. Fabio, I see your hand up.
Hi, thanks, Ben. Yeah, I mean, I actually wanted to address the question you raised earlier is about sort of using Spinoza as a guide to how to live. And, you know, just it's something that was mentioned earlier, actually, with respect to sort of the current climate with, you know, the protests that are falling out of the you know, George Floyd event. Sort of, I mean, this idea of, say what you will about Spinoza philosophically, but I mean, this is someone who, in a time where his punishment could have been much worse for what he did. I mean, he was not only facing, I mean, excommunication was fairly light in compared to what he could have faced for you know, for what he conveyed philosophically. So, I mean, this is someone that I think we can learn about, and sort of, you know, in terms of bravery and kind of the sticking to what we believe, and sticking up for what we think is right, regardless of, you know, I mean, regardless of, again, Spinoza's, you know, what Spinoza thought and whether or not that was right, but I think that this is something that we, you know, we can learn something from personally, I think, in terms of, you know, sticking up and standing up for what we believe in. Something that, you know, students can maybe learn something, or, you know, be inspired from, right? So
Thanks Fabio. So I got Kristen, then Ha Ping, then Hasa next.
Hi everybody. So I usually do make it to pretty far in, but I think it's even with my lower division classes, but I think it's because at least I think it's important for even the lower division students to just get a picture of the big picture, and I encourage them to actually read very quickly through a lot of the demonstrations, because at least in my experience, I find at least my biggest challenge often with teaching undergraduates this stuff is that they will dismiss a demonstration if they find that it's not formally valid, and they just won't be willing to go on. And so I sort of say, you know, just maybe squint, you might have to squint a little bit and just move quite quickly. And sometimes I have to sort of just give them sort of my take on certain aspects of the system, just so we can keep moving forward. But I find that it does get really exciting near the end, and kids really like getting there. And then they start to see, like, the metaphysics in parts 1 and 2 really does matter for, like, the weird, wild stuff that happens at the end. So maybe this means that the undergrads aren't getting a very thorough and super scholarly take in their first pass, but at least, I mean, I found it helps get students excited. So that's what I do.
Great, thanks for that. That's awesome. Ha Ping.
Oh, great. So just to second what all the last speakers just said. Wait, so did you say call my name or Ha's name?
Sorry, I called your name.
Oh, okay, good. I thought Hars's hand is up too. So I actually, especially I want to second what Fabio said about connecting to what's going on now. And so even though my class is philosophy majors, they still struggle with really unfamiliar philosophical texts. So what I did was actually similar to what Shelley did, basically kind of pick parts from book 3, 4, and 5. And then I give them a handout. I call it preparatory handout about relevant stuff from the earlier parts. And so they get a sense of what was going on, how Spinoza got to where he got. And then I quickly connect with often with what's going on, especially I actually told my students, actually, ever since 2016 election, Spinoza is what kept me going. And I often bring up his notion of fortitude, and I remind my students all the time, and often, especially when students get mad at, so to speak, the other side, And I often emphasize the two sides of fortitude. When Spinoza emphasizes both, basically the self-directed kind of kindness, but also, other regarding thing, and Spinoza's emphasis on message particularly relevant in our divisive, political environment. So once students got really excited about that message, they're actually more willing to work through really hard parts of the text. So that's my experience. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Hassa?
Hello. Yes. For my approach with regard to making sense of Spinoza, so I think it is good approach with Spinoza, like with, for example, Thomas Aquinas, to start with some question you already have in mind and see how Spinoza would reply to it, because in this way that things start making sense. Like for me, it's recently I was studying this mind-body problem, and went to Spinoza, and it makes sense. But you need to, I think, to have some question to ask from Spinoza, because if one starts just reading his system as such, it doesn't seem to make any sense at the first. It at least this is the impression. You don't get beyond these first two propositions. But if you have some question to Spinoza, then you will find an answer that is usually very convincing. Yes, so this is my approach to Spinoza.
Thank you. Fabio?
Yes, I actually wanted to follow up on Hassa's question, because this is sort of a question that I always have with respect to Spinoza, in terms of, and this sort of connects to the earlier informal discussion about the history of philosophy, is, I mean, how to fit Spinoza into a sort of historical narrative. Of course, there's one of the traditional ones that's commonly used, which is rationalism, but that's, I mean, I've always found that a bit unhelpful as a narrative in general, and with respect to Spinoza, because it's not always clear in what ways Spinoza is a rationalist. I mean, in sort of the, aside from the geometrical exposition and stuff like that, but in terms of his actual theory of knowledge, it's not always particularly clear. So I wonder, if anybody has any thoughts about ways in which you can fit Spinoza into another or different, more interesting, perhaps, historical narrative. And, if maybe that has something to do with, or connecting it in sort of contextualist ways, Hassa seems to be suggesting. So I was wondering what everyone thought about, if anyone had any thoughts on that.
So, Raphael?
A quick answer, and this is not typically what I do, but many people see Spinoza as part of the history of Marxism. And certainly there are themes in Spinoza you can highlight that lend themselves to that narrative. And I think it's a fun narrative to debate, for sure. You can see him as proto-Nietzschean. I mean, he's exciting because he's adjacent to philosophers that a lot of students already are invested in, and yet they might not have heard of Spinoza.
Thanks. Any other thoughts or ideas? Any other ways in which people like to take Spinoza? Hassa?
Yes, I have a follow-up on this Marxist narrative. This is like a kind of special thing in Spinoza, where you see that Spinoza is a truly great philosopher, that Spinoza fits with many narratives. Like you can see Spinoza as the kind of starting point of Marxism and dialectic materialism, but then you can see Spinoza as also leading to certain forms of mysticism or even esotericism by making everything divine. So, like it's interesting that Spinoza is in a kind of at the one end of this kind of two narratives that have later on in history of philosophy and intellectual history become to be perceived as a very opposite narratives. In a way, escaping to religion and then making everything material and destroying religion. That's really great.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So we'll give Raphael the last word, and then we'll take a small break before we start in on the last two papers of the session. Raphael?
Just following what Hassa said, have you heard the story of the theist and the atheist who met for the first time and realized they were both fans of Spinoza. The atheist says, oh, I was a theist, but Spinoza explained to me that God does not exist. And the theist says, well, I had been an atheist, but then I encountered Spinoza, and he clarified that theism is the truth. Yeah.
Yes.
He's something we can all unite around, no matter what our opinion is.
Yes, but also that we can all oppose very fiercely.
All right, well, thanks everybody for that. So we'll have a 5-minute break, and then Alistair will start us off on the next session. So thanks.